This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, starts today's show with this week's grain market outlook. He explains how what the markets are currently doing is common for this time of year. Wheat production specialist at K-State, Romulo Lollato, keeps the show going as he discusses changes producers might want to make when planting wheat if they are past their optimal planting window. Rounding out the show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with a hopeful weather update. He explains why it is cooler in the mornings than evenings and how Kansas is expected to have moisture next week. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update. And as always, we're joined with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you, Shelby.
And Dan, starting off our conversation how we normally do, discussing futures.
Coming into harvest, of course, we're seeing prices for corn and for soybeans just moderating at what we now consider to be low levels. During this week, we were trading around $4.90 to $5 for corn. And again, there have been times a year ago we were at $1 or $2 higher than that. So for corn, we're kind of hanging around $4.90 to $5 for soybeans. About a little over, we've gotten to the place now with some support for the market that we're over 13 for November, and at least we have traded there this week and have kept trending higher in the soybean futures markets as well. Wheat markets for hard red, winter wheat, again, we've had been on a long trend downward, have been trading here of late, or like 670, 680, again, $1 or so lower than where we've been. I think it's good to compare these recent trends with seasonal prices to see how prevalent seasonal lows have been. And when you look at the carrying charges in the futures, what are they indicating for what the market's anticipating for the rest of the year? Or for corn, we normally have our lows in October, November, so we'd be consistent with that and then tend to trend higher from that all the way in kind of a pretty consistent manner up to May and June. And again, that typically gives us some reward for storage of grains, acknowledges some of the production risks that happen when we get out into the spring. Then once we get into May and June, with June being the typical high about the last 20 years in Kansas corn prices, then we tend to tail off into July and August. So when you look at futures as they're projected for this coming year, you've got a little bit of a price rise, but not as much as the normal seasonal trends would indicate. So not telling farmers to store all their corn, et cetera, but it is interesting that corn futures right now are representing some increase, but they're below a typical seasonal average increase from now on into the spring. Really a pretty similar situation for soybeans. Typically have our lows right during October, right at the time we're talking about, as we're about the middle of the month, and tend to see also prices run higher into June and to hang around a little bit longer into July. So again, some reward for storage, although typically I don't know that people store soybeans quite as long as they do for corn. So you've got that type of situation. And although we see some carrying charges in the futures, again, they're less than we typically would see for a seasonal price rise going on into spring. So again, I'm not telling people necessarily to store their soybeans long term, but the market tends to be somewhat myopic, somewhat front loaded in its view of where prices are going. And when we do see over time a seasonal price rise, it's more the whole complex moving up or down together. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I would say for wheat is more of a challenge for us. The typical hard red winter wheat low has also come during October, especially November. And I'm not sure how I'd explain that, how I'd justify that, but that's just the reality of it. So over the last 20 years, the lowest price has come in November, just after we've seeded. And the highest price actually has come in February. And that makes sense just with a lot of the production uncertainty that's coming at that time. We're wondering how we'll break dormancy for hard red winter wheat, et cetera. When you look at the pattern in the futures, we have, again, just a small amount of carry, not much at all, pretty much sideways, just a small amount higher. And again, at least from November on, we'd be what futures are representing now is less than the typical seasonal pattern of price rise on into February that we tend to see from at least November on into February. So something to watch for all of our ag producers. By the time we get to this point, this time of year, people's cash flow needs come into play, of course, and do they need to sell to generate income to pay off any notes that we have that came into being because we had to buy crop inputs. So there are those issues, but once the upfront cash flow demands are met, then we find ourselves often in the storage mode and try to figure out how the markets would recover. I would say that as I look at that situation this year, Shelby, I think we are so dependent for price volatility on the condition of crops in South America. There are some, and those conditions are not just sterling right now. There are reports of dryness in parts of Argentina. It's affected some crops. Dryness in I believe the southern parts of Brazil. And so typically the market in October will say, well, there's a lot of time yet to come, et cetera. But we're not just starting off with that with full bore and no challenges yet. You have the major trade associations in South America and projecting record crops, et cetera. And they're not counting any negative weather events into their forecasts. So I guess it's a matter of what the market chooses to pay attention to. And so I think that I would not just, if I were ag producers, I would not discount the amount of uncertainty and volatility that we could have going on into the spring. And that's not even accounting for all the geopolitical carryover impacts that we could have as well. So I guess we're in the harvest mode for these crops and wondering where things will go. But I would just offer the idea of the typical seasonal patterns do tend to take us out of this once the harvest is done and we start focusing on usage and trying to account for any weather concerns in other major production areas of the world.
And Dan, something else that our agricultural producers could be paying attention to is ethanol prices and production.
Yeah, sure. Interesting to see that from a corn market perspective, what the bids are at ethanol plants now in Kansas relative to the rest of the nation and also relative to where they were a year ago. Compared to a year ago, Kansas ethanol plant corn bids were averaging $7.77. That was the average, and there were higher than lower than that. Some at $8, some a little bit lower, less than that. But this year, and that was by far the highest in the nation. Next closest was Nebraska at 726, also caught up in some of the dry weather maladies. Well, this year, it turns out, at least for this week, that the average ethanol plant corn bid in Kansas is $4.94. And again, that's the highest in the nation. And the next highest being about $4.81, again in Nebraska, $4.80 in eastern Iowa. So I think with the advent of harvest this year, we've seen lower prices. That tends to be supportive of profitability in ethanol. It's interesting to see that the trends for ethanol stocks have been actually trending lower, and that most of the time that's a good sign for that ethanol markets aren't overburdened, as tends to be supportive of prices. So we've come through this time with at least moderately okay ethanol prices and sideways to lower corn input prices, and that's generally a recipe for profitability in the ethanol industry.
And taking now a little bit of a deeper look into corn and soybeans and its tighter supplies.
Yes, I think the big issues now, as we sit having digested the October 12th WASDE report, going towards the November 9th WASDE and crop production reports, there's a question of where corn yields would go now. The USDA projected 173 bushels per acre and a crop of just over 15 billion, about 15.1 billion bushels of corn. And in my own thinking, there's probably a 60% chance that they're right. We're getting more information, but we're not fully dug in with that being the final numbers. In my own thinking, there's about a 40% chance of some degree of lower corn yields coming in. And the pragmatic farmers in the audience would say, well, gosh, so he's saying 60% chance that it's right, 40% wrong. But there is a chance probably that corn yields could go lower. Let's say it went from 173 down to 172. Very possible, according to the USDA's projection of reliability on those numbers. then you'd be down to 14.98 billion. Another bushel down, you'd be down to 14.89 to 14.8 if you go down to 170 bushels an acre. If we end up in those scenarios with USDA's projection of 495, we start getting over $5, more like 515, 535, 555 if we go all the way to 170. But we have to get basically to 171 or below to actually start moving the ending stocks figure below 2 billion and putting ourselves in a lot more risky situation. Pretty similar question for soybeans. I think there's probably more risk of lower soybean yields than those early numbers, just because it's a little later developing crop and stories we've heard, reports from the field, et cetera, that may or may not be right. So about a 55% chance that the USDA's projection of 49.6 bushels per acre is right. So approximately a 45% likelihood of something much lower than that. So you end up at, if you drop that number down to say 48 or 47 bushels per acre, you do start going from the 1290 projection, the USDA projected, up to, you start adding, going from about 1290 to 1375 to 1475. If you go all the way to 47, then where do we go? That's really the question. And would tightness in the U.S. by itself lead the market to a strongly higher outcome with the South American crop still coming? I think that'll be driven by export demand. It's just how worried the rest of the world would be, and particularly China, in terms of potential short supplies. So interesting to watch, and we'll be watching closely, as well as all the rest of the ag markets, on November 9th to see what the USDA comes out and says.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our grain market update for the week.
Thank you very much, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was Kansas State University grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Friday show discussing some articles in the recent Agronomy E-Update. And then to talk about his articles, we're joined with K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thank you for having me here today, and good morning to all the growers listening out there.
And so, Romulo, your two articles that you have in this Agronomy E-Update discuss wheat. And so, Romulo, first, what have planting conditions been like for wheat?
Well, Shelby, I guess as most years in Kansas, what we can say is that it has been kind of spotty depending where you are in the state, right? And so I think that just providing some background there of why it has been spotty before we get into the how. We are coming out of 3 years in a row of La Nina, right? And so very, very dry conditions across those 3 years, meaning that we had summer crops that depleted the soil moisture, and we had previous wheat crops that also depleted soil moisture. So we're kind of getting into that September planting time with a very limited profile soil moisture, right? With that, there were scattered rains across the state. That's kind of why I say it's kind of spotty, right? Back in the mid part of September, we had up to 2 to 4 inches in parts of southwest Kansas, right? And so for that region, you really kick off planting right there, right? Because the growers having that type of moisture, they are not going to be waiting too much. And even though it might be a little bit on the early side for planting, they might end up with a really decent stand, right? And so that southwest part of the state, which had been the part that had been impacted the most by those 3 years of drought that we had, at least planting conditions, they were in pretty good shape, and many fields out there that I'm seeing either on social media or visiting with growers, they are off to a good start. Then later a little bit there, towards the late part of September, early part of October, there was some rain that came by in northwest and north central Kansas that kind of helped those regions as well. Now, the more central part of the state, say Poisington and kind of going south and east from there, it has been a little bit drier, right? It has been a little bit on the drier side. And honestly, even a lot of the summer crops suffered a lot through it. And I'm hearing a lot of 10, 12 bushel soybean being harvested. And that's never good news, because not only for monetary reasons for the grower who is not really harvesting a good soybean crop, well, that just shows how dry we are, right? I've actually heard about growers planting on a standing crop of soybeans because there was not enough yield potential to be harvested in this central part of the state. Now, again, we look 10 days back in the region around Saline or so, they had some rain again, and so emergence should come out nice there. I'll go south from there, McPherson and south. Conditions are pretty rough, right? The soybean crop with those very low yield potentials show us how tough the conditions were, and really haven't had much moisture, even in the topsoil, to get a good crop emerge. Now, with all that said, right, I mentioned a few large regions of the state that were able to get some good progress in planting and potentially some good emergence there, with southwest, northwest, and north central part of the state. I guess that we look in those regions is where they should be planted already anyways. The central, south central parts of the state, they can have slightly later planting dates than that. So even for planting now, the crop still has a good potential in those regions as long as we get some moisture. So that's kind of an overview of how things have been so far in terms of planting progress. I think that growers in the central, south central part of the state, they're pretty anxious about some moisture to come by so they can actually release the drill, right, and get all of that crop planted. But all in all, the state of Kansas is about 70% done with wheat planting, which is right there on average. On average for this time of around October 20th here, we are around that 68 to 70%. So we're right on average this year. And I believe that the regions that needed to be planted are kind of planted already, which is nice to hear.
Romulo, for the producer who is planting their wheat a little bit late or is thinking they're probably going to end up planting their wheat late, what is something they might want to keep in mind when it comes to quantity of tillers in their field?
Yeah, so giving some background there, right? Whenever we plant wheat at the optimum time, that means that the wheat is going to have enough temperature accumulation in the fall to produce tillers. And those fall tillers, they are the most productive ones, right? So let's say that someone in Colby is planted on September 25th and they get their rain right after. That gives the crop enough time to tiller out and produce many of those very productive fall tillers. Now, if somebody in Colby is planting today, October 20th, they're losing a whole month of temperature accumulation. So very likely that crop is not going to have too many degrees accumulated there before it goes into winter dormancy. And so we might end up with many less or fewer tillers per plant, right? And so what we want to do when we're planting late like this in terms of management adjustments is ramp up seeding rates, right? That's the main thing that we recommend. And again, because each plant is not going to tiller as much, we need to compensate for that reduced tillering by simply having more plants out there, right? And that's pretty clear. I mean, there's a lot of research showing that as we delay planting dates past the optimum, we should be ramping up those populations, right? And, there's some rule of thumb there. For every week that you're past that optimum, bumping up 10 to 15 pounds per acre from where your starting point was is probably a good practice. Although there's a maximum too, right? You don't want to get to a point where you have more than 120, 130 pounds of seed out there, because then you can run into other issues, right? Lodging and just excessive water use as well, in case there is a good canopy development. And so there is a max out there. But again, for every week that we're going late, it is warranted to bump those seeding rates up 10 to perhaps 15 pounds per acre just to compensate for the lack of tillering.
Romulo, something else you mentioned in your agronomy update article that producers might want to consider is a starter phosphorus fertilizer.
Yes, absolutely. So phosphorus as a starter, right, placed in furrow there with the seed, it really helps in this situation where we're planting late. And the reason for that is that we're making that phosphorus immediately available to the plant, which turns into greater potential for tiller production and greater biomass production as well early in the season, which are things that are limited in a late planted wheat crop. And so, having 20 to 30 pounds of phosphorus fertilizer directly with the seed per acre is actually, I kind of think of phosphorus as a money in the bank, specifically in a few situations. One of them is this late planting. Another is if growers are going to graze the crop, that they really need more forage out there, or if they're planting in acid or low pH soils where phosphorus is less available. And then, of course, in soils that are naturally low in phosphorus, right? So in those situations, phosphorus is typically money on the bank. So again, if I'm changing at least two things there when I'm planting late, will be ramping up seeding rates, putting out in furrow phos to make sure that we have a good start to the crop. Now, there's a couple other things we can talk about here too, right? And then one of them is we're planting late, we're planting into cooler soils, right? And so there's going to be a longer time between planting and emergence. And so that seed is going to be exposed to cooler, perhaps moist conditions for a longer than usual time. And that can cause some fungal disease, some soil-borne diseases to increase as well, right? So many times we suggest, if you're planting late, that's typically when we see the best benefit from putting a fungicide seed treatment. So of course, that's an option there as well, right? And so long-term research that we've done, we show typically that the yield gain that we have in most conditions from that fungicide seed treatment, it at least breaks even with the cost, right? We're maybe talking about a bushel and a half per acre from that fungicide seed treatment, and more likely than not to occur in these late planted conditions. And then finally, if there's flexibility in terms of which variety is going to be planted, that's something to be considered as well, although that's a harder one because by this time growers should already have pretty set which varieties they're going to plant. But it's just a matter of thinking we're planting late, we're delaying the entire crop cycle, right? So we're going to delay when the crop is going to come out of winter dormancy. We're going to delay when heading is going to occur. And so, if possible, we want to try to avoid some varieties that are too late in maturity, right? Otherwise, you're going to get a late maturing variety and you're going to expose it to a condition where it's even later, right? So that's probably the main thing on variety selection here is try to see varieties that have very good winter hardiness. They're not going to have as much time to cold acclimate as usual. But not only that, something that is not too late in maturity as well, so we can kind of compensate for that late planting. And again, Shelby, right now, for growers who are thinking of course, still planting, right, at 30% that they're still missing to be planted out in the state, the main question is, should I go ahead and plant? Or, what do I do? Do I wait on a rain? Because conditions are dry, right? In the region where it hasn't been planted, it is quite dry. And the good news, we're going to talk to Chip Redmond here in a little bit, so I'm not going to get into too much of that. But good news is that there is some good rain on the forecast here. And so I will definitely be going out and planting as much as possible before the potential rain for a few reasons, right? If you're planting in a dry soil, you're going to get a better distribution of those seeds, and you're probably going to be able to cover more ground in the same time, just for planting in that drier topsoil. And growers can think of just like keeping the same planting depth, right? I would not make it any shallower because the crop will be more exposed to cold temperatures there and potentially winter kill. So just keep the same planting depth, 1 to 1.5 inches there, and really let that planting go so that we're in hope for that moisture that may come out next week.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some planting considerations for those who might be planting their wheat a little bit later than usual.
Thank you, Shelby. Always great to visit with you.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. I will link his Agronomy E-Update articles in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update. And as always, we're joined with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
During this time of year, or this past week, a lot of times cold in the morning, and then it's nice and toasty in the afternoon. And why is that?
Yeah, well, so we're in the fall now. Our average temperatures are still continuing to fall. That's why they call it fall. Through the season, and as a result, we have a lot drier air that moves in. We had in the summer months, we have a lot of moisture and ambient moisture with kind of southerly flow. Well, now we're getting periods of cold fronts that swing through. They basically scour that moisture down to the south and east of us, and we end up with a dry air mass. Dry air can warm up very quickly with the solar radiation. It also cools off very quickly because it just takes less energy, basically. And so as temperatures fluctuate, when we get that solar radiation, we warm up much more than we would if we had humidity in the air because it takes more energy to warm the air when it's moist. And so we warm up really quickly, and then at night, as soon as that sun sets, we lose our incoming solar radiation. We can cool off very quickly with the low humidity and the low moisture in the air. We see really strong inversions this time of year, so basically a stable layer at the surface, because the surface cools a lot faster than the air, and then that surface, once it cools the air just above it and creates a stable layer. And so we can get some big temperature differences just from basically your first story of your house, 3 to 5 feet, to the second story up to 15, 20 feet. We can have temperature differences like 15 to 10 degrees at night for a couple hours till that cool air and that stable air builds vertically and builds in height and altitude it'll get into the hundreds of feet at night. That's why we're always cold, especially in the valley. We look at the river valleys, and Manhattan, for instance, sits in the valley. So it does get cooler here than if you were on a hillside in the Flint Hills.
And Chip, speaking of moisture for this past week, have we had any?
Yeah, so dry air means that we haven't had much moisture. We've had some sprinkles here and there, but not enough to really influence the ambient moisture. And our surfaces really dried out across most of the state with really dry conditions the last 7 days.
So not much change in the drought monitor then?
No, little changes in drought monitor. We saw minor improvement where we had a corridor of about an inch and a half in McPherson, Rice County area. And then degradations actually around the Kansas City area where they've gone multiple weeks now without rain. And things are drying out really quickly.
And something that a lot of the state has seen this past week is wind.
Yeah, when we combine the dry conditions we've seen in the persistent, extreme, exceptional drought, along with wind, it means blowing dust too, and just not really pleasant conditions, but classic for Kansas fall, where we've got these frontal systems pushing through with a strong pressure gradient that results in gusty winds.
And as we look forward, what can people be expecting?
This warm and cool in the morning conditions with the prevailing dryness is going to change. We're going to see a small chance of sprinkles on Sunday, but then we see this, basically it's an omega block, so high pressure across the central United States with lows off to the west and to the east. That whole pattern is going to shift to the east, and it's going to result in that low in the west starting to influence us. We're going to watch. We've got Hurricane Norma down in the eastern Pacific. That's going to tap moisture or send moisture northward ahead of the next storm system that comes with that pattern change. And it's going to basically transport a ton of moisture in the central United States. South of us, Oklahoma, Texas, they're talking like 2 to 4 inches of rain. It looks like most of Kansas should see moisture, most likely in the 1 to 2 inch range. Highest most likely in the southeast, south central part of the state. Less as the things sit right now. These are blocking patterns as they break down are really hard to predict. And so there definitely will be some change in where that corridor strongest precipitation. But it looks like widespread rain from Tuesday to Thursday next week.
And so with that moisture possibly coming in, more consistently cool days then?
Yep, we'll see increased cloud cover and humidity. We'll have more moisture, so the temperatures isn't going to drop off nearly as much at night, and we're definitely not going to get as warm in the afternoon. We'll be more towards normal, which is in the low 40s and in the middle 60s. And then as that system starts to push off late next week, starting to watch potential, there could be some snow, maybe in the far northwest. I don't think it'll be a lot. We look further west in the Rockies, there potentially could get a lot of snow. But cold air is coming, and we'll definitely see cooler weather to bring in November.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.